Now, before I begin, I will advertise the fact that I am live on Twitter. So we might get a few people listening. Okay. So hopefully I am audible to anyone who's out there at the moment. So for reasons that will become apparent, I'm going to discuss today the purpose of philosophy and perhaps epistemology more narrowly as well, or at least what I see as the purposes of philosophy, analytical philosophy, if you like, philosophy in the Western tradition, philosophy that helps us to understand the nature of science and mathematics and all those other disciplines, and not least of which is how to live a good life, that kind of thing. Tomorrow, I'll be doing an event with Euron Brook, and we'll be talking about capitalism, among other things. And he's in Australia at the moment. He was in Brisbane for the last couple of days over the weekend. He's in Sydney tonight, and he'll be in Sydney again tomorrow. And there's a lot to talk about in Australia, philosophically speaking, at the moment. Not only because we are living at an unusual time where the Jewish people everywhere around the world are suffering a kind of discrimination we've not seen for many decades in Western countries of the Anglosphere in particular. But it's been ramping up, and here in Australia, in Melbourne, we recently had a terrorist attack on a synagogue there, which has affected people greatly. So I want to ask you, Ron, about that, being someone who has served time in the IDF and who understands these issues really, really well. And of course, we'll talk capitalism. Wrong, important and essential though it is, to our tradition of criticism, our culture of error correction, the most fundamental part of which is freedom of speech, or freedom of expression. Free trade or capitalism follows close behind because we want to be able to speak freely about the goods and services that we want to trade with one another and how to improve them or what's wrong with them and how to generate more wealth, a key part of my epistemological worldview, shaped by Popper and Deutsch, of course. And last of all, the free vote. Okay, so these three things that I've talked about so often frequently, I think are part of the explanation as to why we have rapid progress in the West, which is stable and able to be maintained in such a way that we can continue to accelerate the rate of progress and not go off the rails completely. This is why philosophy and epistemology are important. We want to know how to make the world a better place. And you might think, well, a scientific worldview is all that you need. And I used to think that. And so I'm going to tell the story that I've told quite often for reasons that will become quickly apparent, I will say. Because there are people who are very interested in philosophy, and good on them. And they're interested in epistemology, and good on them. And they want to read the books by David Deutsch, and good on them for that, because they've heard very successful people give high praise to the work of David Deutsch. And so they come to the book because they want to be smarter people, or they want to have a psychological experience, almost something spiritual and mystical about it. But that's not the way that I encountered the work of David Deutsch. And I think that if you're coming to philosophy, your motivation for why you're coming to philosophy is important. I don't want to denigrate the idea that if you think that philosophy is a very important tool to have in your mental arsenal as you go about the world. And so therefore you're going to start with the ancient Greeks. You're going to make your way through Plato and Aristotle, Xenophanes. And then you're going to move on to the classical era philosophers from Hume and Descartes and Spinoza, and Kant and Locke and more besides. And then into the modern day, you're going to read Wittgenstein and Heidegger and Hegel and Popper, perhaps. Maybe that's what you want to do. Maybe you want to have a large number of books that you can sit in front of and then quote extensively from those books. You can be a philosopher. You can do philosophy and you can understand philosophy and you can talk about the history of ideas and that kind of thing. Okay, you can do that. You may be in psychological distress and be looking for answers that traditional religion hasn't given you, and perhaps your counselor hasn't been able to help you with if you're someone who goes to therapy. So I can only speak for myself, but I think a lot of people are like this, and I have a feeling that Karl Popper himself was a little bit like this as well, because Karl Popper begins his works with instances of where there's a problem coming from outside of philosophy. So what was my problem? I've told this story again and again. I apologize to listeners and viewers who've heard this before. But going into I desperately wanted to do astronomy at university. It's all I wanted to do, astronomy and cosmology, because I wanted to understand the deepest problems about the biggest things at the most grand scales. I knew the planet was big, but the solar system was bigger than that, and the galaxy was bigger than that. And I was a little kid, and I just thought, what's bigger than the biggest thing we know about? And the universe would just get larger and larger and larger the more and more you learned about it, until you figure out there's this thing called the Big Bang, and all of cosmology, everything in physical reality, ultimately can have its origins traced to that. And there's evidence that triangulates on a simple explanation, the Big Bang. Not to say the answer is given a final and comprehensive. No, in fact, they reveal more problems. I'll speak to any cosmologist about the many and varied problems to do with the origins of the universe. And so off I go from high school to university to learn all this stuff, be excited about it, and I was. But nothing in high school much gave me an indication about the mystery that was quantum theory. And so going to a traditional university, doing a very traditional degree in physics, you get hit over the head very early on with lots and lots of classical mechanics and electromagnetism, all the stuff to do with forces and classical physics, Newtonian physics, the physics of Maxwell and Faraday and so on. Not until second year, really. Yeah, there's some hint of it in the first year, but really in the second year, it's when you encounter relativity and quantum theory. And quantum theory in particular is the problematic one. And you learn about the twin slit experiment. And that, of all the experiments early on that you learn about, is the most mysterious one, because you're told about firing single particles at this twin slit. And you know about the twin slit experiment because in first year they told you all about wave mechanics and what happens to water waves as they pass through a barrier where there are two holes or openings through which the water waves can pass. And once they pass through, they interfere constructively and destructively, producing an interference pattern. And you understand the explanation about how when a crest of one wave meets the trough of another wave, you get perfect cancellation. Destructive interference. Constructive interference is where two crests meet and become bigger, or two troughs meet and become more depressed still. So you can get bigger waves and smaller waves. And so, wonderful. What a wonderful explanation. Hard to vary. Good explanation. But then you are presented with this wonderful mystery problem in quantum theory that when you fire single photons or single electrons or even single entire atoms, one at a time, over time, the same interference pattern builds up. But you know for a fact that what you're firing are particles. And you can do other experiments like place detectors where the slits are and show that the particle that you fire remains a particle. It doesn't turn into a wave mysteriously once it reaches the slits. It's a particle the entire way through. But something must be interfering with that particle. After all, If nothing was interfering with it, then what you would expect as you throw individual particles through these twin slits is an image, a shadow of those two slits. But you don't see a shadow of the two slits. You see the complex interference pattern that would happen were you sending waves through these twin slits. But you're not sending waves through because, as I say, you can already do experiments to figure out what these things called photons or electrons or indeed whole atoms are. You can do other experiments called the photoelectric effect that show you there are physical collisions between these particles. Now, particles aren't point-like. They're more complicated than that. But they're not waves. They're not extended entirely throughout space. As David Deutsch explains in the beginning of infinity, they're more like ink blots. And so I was struggling to understand that experiment in particular. And I read every popular science book I could get my hand on. And as the story goes, not until 1997, which just happened to coincide with when I was at university doing this, did I find The Fabric of Reality by David Deutsch. And I read that book, Chapter 2, Shadows, and it solved my problem. What was my problem? Understanding what was happening, being able to explain to someone else what was happening in this twin slit experiment. I could describe the experiment, I could describe the problems with the experiment and trying to understand the experiment, but I didn't have the solution until I read that book. And then I realized I had other problems because that was not the only explanation. I'd read the other explanations, none of which made sense to me. But the many worlds interpretation, the multiverse, made sense to me. It was logical. It was hard to vary. It made predictions. And it all held together coherently in very simple terms, as David lays it out there. As I say, wonderful sense of fun, of vertigo, of being on a roller coaster and realizing the thrill of understanding and a change in your perspective on the world. But other people would say, in fact, university lecturers and tutors and professors and so on, they would say, it's not important how you interpret these experiments. What's important is, can you use the formalism, can you use the mathematics to make predictions about what will happen? That is instrumentalism. Now, I didn't know at first how to argue against this. I wasn't sophisticated enough, knowledgeable enough. I didn't understand until, as I made my way through the Fabric of Reality and talked to other people about the Fabric of Reality so that I could have a deeper understanding of it myself and indeed interrogate David Deutsch, because he was very polite and helped me online via email and so on to understand the finer details of all this. And then to begin to recognize that this shut up and calculate instrumentalist idea of don't worry your pretty little head about what's really going on with the twin slit experiment, just be able to use the Schrödinger wave equation, whatever it happens to be, in order to predict what's going to happen as a quantum system evolves over time. That's all you need to do. You just need to be able to solve the numerical problems. You don't have to explain what's really going on. In fact, what does this word really mean anyway? Instrumentalism is fine. Now, at first I didn't understand why we couldn't just be instrumentalists. And David explains and unpacks throughout the book. In no other area of science do we ever do this. We don't say of the fossils, well, we can't possibly have an opinion on what caused these fossils. All we can talk about is in what strata which particular fossil is found and of what kind of rock it happens to be. But we must remain silent on those things we can't observe. Gradually, after many months and indeed years of, carefully trying to unpack David's work and Karl Popper's work, I then began to realize science is about explaining the seen in terms of the unseen. Science is about explanations because we want to understand reality. We're curious about it. We don't just want to make predictions. That's a philosophy, and that's why philosophy is important. If you don't have a philosophy, that's a philosophy. Okay, to say I don't have a philosophy, well, what an interesting philosophy that happens to be. To claim you don't have one, and to claim that the only purpose of science is to make predictions, not to understand reality. Which, by the way, of course, this whole idea that science is only and can only be about making predictions only ever applies to theoretical physics or particle physics, perhaps. It doesn't apply to meteorology, where we actually want to know that the rain is being caused by the clouds that are coming, and there could be a thunderstorm, and we can explain why. Prediction coming from good explanation about what really exists, what that thing does, and what it's likely to do. Deeper principles about condensation and wind and so on. Biology, chemistry, geology, astronomy, all of these domains of understanding that we have, these subject areas, they're not primarily about prediction, but explanation and understanding. So that is how I got into philosophy and epistemology. I wasn't coming to it out of some deeply problematic teenage angst of a kind. I was thrilled to encounter physics, confused when I didn't understand quantum physics, and then thrilled once more when I encountered David Deutsch's clarity of exposition on something like the twin slit experiment and then everything else. It just so happened that when I was at university and doing mathematics, I also realized I really liked this stuff called logic and computation. Now, I don't know why, but in my first year at uni, they forced the physics students to do an electronics course, literally about how logic gates work in the hardware of a computer, AND gates, NOR gates, all these sorts of gates. And so it's very logical. And I quite enjoyed that, even though I was forced into doing it. I thought, this is interesting. And that led me off to the mathematics department, where they made me do lots and lots of calculus, but they also had options of other things you do. And I thought, logic and computability, I want to do that one. And it just so happened that in Fabric of Reality, that was a central part of the book, computation and Turing machines. And so I got to study that at university alongside, in lockstep with, reading the Fabric of Reality. It was thrilling. You go off to the philosophy department, and then they teach more courses on logic and philosophical logic. And so everything for me cohered around the fact that I was formally studying a thing. And as anyone who goes to university and especially does a science degree, sometimes it is extremely dry, even if you have a great lecturer. And sometimes it's confusing. And so I felt so happy that I'd found the Fabric of Reality. It just happened at the right time, because it was explaining to me the contents of my university course that otherwise I think would have been far more opaque and confusing to me than what they were. Here was David Deutsch putting it in simple terms with a spin. The Popperian explanatory spin on things. And more than that, challenging my intuitions in the most profound ways. So, for example, one part that I love, and that anyone who watches Topcast will know, is Chapter 10, The Nature of Mathematics. Hitherto an area that I've been told throughout all of high school and at university, this is the one domain in which you can get absolutely certain truth. And David has that line that I just quote again and again and again: necessary truth is merely the subject matter of mathematics. It is not the reward you get for doing mathematics. End quote. How brilliant and how beautiful. And it is not just a throwaway line that is a quip to be quoted now and again. It comes from David's own explanations about computation and physics. It comes from that area because error is everywhere. No computer can avoid having an error correction mechanism, because the errors creep in. Computation and proof, what we do is a physical process. It's the universality of computation. David's very area of expertise, because he wrote the paper on it. And so even in the area of mathematics, nothing is left seemingly untouched by this Popperian and David Deutsch worldview. And that's why I came to it. And then when the beginning of infinity arrived, I realized even more was underscored the importance of philosophy. And so while I was at university doing that first degree where I did physics, I started doing philosophy of science. And as I've also told the story, I did lots of courses in philosophy, classic philosophy, ancient philosophy, but Karl Popper was barely even a footnote, that guy who did falsification. And then the beginning of infinity came out, many years after I'd graduated with that first degree. And although I'd done philosophy at university alongside of physics, I didn't really appreciate still the crucial importance of philosophy in having a rational worldview and having a realistic philosophy at that. And so it was then that I sort of realized, and I've come to understand myself, that philosophy explains things like why societies differ one from another, why some places like the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, places in Europe, have had rapid progress, tend in the direction of peace and stability, while other places are mired in stasis and constant eruptions of violence. That you cannot separate out philosophy from the most important parts of human life and civilization. That philosophy is what explains, as long as you have a good philosophy, the right philosophy, how it is that human beings come to make progress through error correction and what we are as people. For so long, I was interested in this question about what a person is because I knew that people were different. So consciousness, our ability to tell right from wrong, the capacity to suffer, to appreciate beauty. No, it's our capacity to explain anything, not in practice, but in principle, to see problems and fall in love with them and to try to understand the solution by generating explanations about physical reality that we can come to reflect the rest of physical reality, as David says so eloquently in that TED talk, Chemical Scum That Dream of Distant Quasars. That here in our minds, the mind of any human being on planet Earth, is a system, the human mind, abstract, running on this physical substrate that is the brain, that is able to look out into the world and reflect the world, model the world, and over time correct errors in its own model of the world such that the model of the world comes to reflect the reality beyond, the objective reality out there, via this method of error correction. Now, this is explained by Karl Popper. These are not trivial things, this matter of error correction and problem encountering and solution creating, and therefore the categorical difference between a person, which includes alien intelligence and AGI should it ever come, human beings, our cousins and ancestors, and all other life and all other systems that are out there in physical reality. Those are not solving problems about how to explain the rest of physical reality, but we are, and because we are, we're able to gain control of physical reality over time. All of this is the most inspiring picture of reality and rationality that I think has ever been gifted to humanity, because it goes beyond what any traditional religion has ever said. And what traditional religion has said has been wonderful in a sense, namely that human life is sacred, that humans are, in a sense, the center of something important, the center of God's concern, let's say. Okay, so religion gets something right that atheism, denuded of anything like that, doesn't. But what David Deutsch does is put humans back into the center in a sense, namely that people are a hub, as he says, of knowledge creation. We're not just a chemical scum that has arisen by chance in order to follow the same fate that every other species that has ever existed is going to follow, namely towards the road of extinction. We can solve our problems. We can generate knowledge. We can protect ourselves and thrive, not merely here on the surface of the earth, but off into the indefinite and infinite future. How inspiring. How inspiring indeed. So why do I begin with all of that? Because I think that if you come to philosophy and you come to epistemology, coming at it without first having a problem that comes out of science, you're struggling to understand why these scientific theories change every few years, what the role of experiment is. This is the stuff I was really interested in. Maybe you come from a historic, you're interested in history. Why do different people talking about the same events, or different cultures talking about the same events, disagree on the facts of the matter? It's a philosophical question. It's not within history, but the philosophy of history. Or politics. Why shouldn't we have philosopher kings? And what is democracy anyway? What does free speech give us? Is free speech logically and morally prior to value free speech than the enterprise of science itself? Yes, it is. So you might come from philosophy, you might come from history, I should say, or science. You might come from mathematics and want to understand, is infinity real? Or is the denial of infinity a part of rationality, because we can never possibly observe or get to or reach infinity, something like that? Philosophy is there to solve problems in other subject areas. It can't just be done denuded from the concretes. And when I say concretes, I mean specific examples. You go to Karl Popper's work and you go to Conjectures and Refutations, and what you find is there are hundreds of references to what Newton was doing, what problem he was solving. Einstein, Bohr, Lavoisier, biologists, chemists, geologists, and physicists. Popper is talking about those concrete examples of things that happened in history, problems that scientists were trying to solve, where they went wrong, why they went right, and the role of the experiment in differentiating between better and worse theories, and what a good theory amounts to. This is a unique picture of the world that you may get partially in some other places to some degree. But I don't want to rely upon my authority. As someone who read a great philosopher like David Hume, and I have great respect for the work of David Hume, I think brilliant British empiricist. But there's just a whole other level of sophistication, of comprehensiveness to the worldview of David Deutsch and Karl Popper that you don't get anywhere else. And it's not done in the abstract. I'll be speaking to you, Ron, tomorrow. I don't know if it will come up. But when I read Ayn Rand, it's very narrow. There are aspects of it that I think are absolutely brilliant. The defense of capitalism, the defense of individual liberty, I think are truly inspired and powerful. But the epistemology, there's a poverty there. There is a lack of grappling with what we're trying to do when we create knowledge, which is not to reach the final truth, not to get to the truth or justify our truths, not to rest upon certainty and dogmatically be committed to a particular perspective, but rather to improve and make progress by finding errors in what we already know, correcting those errors, and then guessing at what something better might be, and then criticizing that as a community or as an individual. And thus we make progress incrementally. So I've spent a lot of time actually engaging with the work of Ayn Rand, for example, criticizing it. But one thing I can say about Rand is no one can say she's unclear. She's clear. There's clarity there, and I must respect that. I like people who are clear. And if they're wrong, I can say why they're wrong and where they're wrong. So, for example, Ayn Rand demands that we begin with a solid foundation of truth that we cannot doubt, the law of identity. She calls it A equals A. And upon that we derive conclusions. So we have an edifice of knowledge. It's a thing I've talked about time and time again. And I disagree with that, but full respect to her, she lays out the case, although I think it's wrong, because knowledge is more like a web. Any or all of it can be wrong at any given time. The truths that we find are mixed with misconception, and the conjunction of truth and falsehood is always false. Okay, that's logic. But what we're doing when we construct knowledge is not just a logical process. It's not just a deductive logical process. It's a creative one. It's not inductive. It's not deductive, and forget abductive, as some people try, and insert another technical word in there as if you invent a term and you've explained something. I disagree with that. It's a neologism, abductive, but it does mean guess. So I'll give them that. But I'd rather just stick with guess. And guess, just like conjecture and just like the word create, these things are open to interpretation. I can't be precise. They're always going to be ambiguous. And we don't know how they work. We don't know how we create explanations. We know we do, and we know that it's about error correction. So it's not like we know nothing, but what we do know is enough to be able to say, we don't understand it all because we can't program it. Another part of David Deutsch's work that is inspiring, a great heuristic. If you can't program it, you don't understand it. Okay. Now, people often ask me, what part of the philosophy of David Deutsch do you disagree with? And as I keep saying recently, because it comes up all the time, because people think that because I am so inspired by the work of David Deutsch, and I have spent hours and years unpacking the beginning of infinity, the fabric of reality. I promise I will be getting back to that very, very soon. Many other things have come in the way recently. And all the other associated podcasts and content that I've put out there, that they think I am an irrational fan, a fanatic of David Deutsch, and am unwilling or unable to critique any of the content of his books. But the thing is, that was already done earlier and elsewhere in places that people didn't see. For the previous 20-something years that I've been familiar with this work and engaging with people online and with David himself, trying to clarify in my own mind. I remember taking David Deutsch to task on email publicly years ago because I was, a university student who was learning about Descartes. And I just assumed that, of course you can be certain because Rene Descartes said you could be certain that I think, therefore I am as a necessary truth, and you've got that truth. You know you exist, and that's it. There's no way you can be wrong about that. I was sure. I was sure about many things, and I challenged David on them, and each time I challenged him, we had a conversation. And I understood where my misconceptions were. So it's not like I don't understand the impulse. Reading something that you think is amazing, and then now and again coming across something where you think that can't possibly be the case. I know better. It could be the case that you know better. It could be. Everyone can be wrong. We're all fallible. But with an effort, as I hope I've taken over the years, you can come to understand the other perspective. And you might even be persuaded by it, which I generally was. And so that brings me to someone who has claimed to have been persuaded and then has changed their mind and decided that David Deutsch's work is a dead end. And so I am going to go through some of this article that appeared during the week on X. It was an article it's been published on Substack, and you can look it up. It's called The Deutschian Dead End by a person called Kazra. And it's subtitled, Critical Rationalism is Full of Tortured Rationalizations. Now, I have read this twice, and I initially responded just on Twitter. And for whatever reason, the article has hit a nerve with many supporters of the article. And I don't know why, because as I read it the first time, I thought this is just so far off base, so completely misconceived, that the person either hasn't read the book or has done what Naval Ravikant has said that many people do with something like The Beginning of Infinity. They say they've read it or they've skimmed over it, but they haven't really. It hasn't gone in. And this happens even to the brightest minds of our age. There are many famous public intellectuals out there that I've talked about before who claim to be fans of David Deutsch and the beginning of infinity, and indeed to endorse his worldview on things like knowledge and conjectural knowledge and good explanations and so on. And then they attempt to articulate part of it and they get it completely wrong. Or within a couple of weeks of saying that they'd read the book, you then hear them talk about knowledge and you hear them talk about how they're going to justify certain things as true or what the degrees of belief might be. And you realize we didn't really appreciate much of the central themes in the book. And so this that I'm about to go through, this article, is emblematic of that kind of thing, where it is misconception piled on top of misconception piled on top of misconception. The mistakes mount, but more than that is this unfortunate condescending anger that permeates throughout the entirety of the article. It reads as if to say, I understand he uses the word Deutschian, okay? The author of the piece that is critiquing the work of David Deutsch uses the word Deutschian over and over again, which is a tell. In my mind, it's always a tell when people use the word Deutschian, because no one uses that term except the critics. Right? It's like Randian. No one uses the term except the critics. They're not sufficiently familiar with the work to understand that it's not a word that's used. And it doesn't convey anything. I mean, what does it mean? What does it really label? What is Deutschian? What is Deutschian? I couldn't tell you. How is Deutschian different to Popperian, let's say? There are things like, for example, optimism. Optimism in David Deutsch's sense is slightly different to the way in which optimism is usually used, because optimism, the word, like all words, and David is the first one to say this. In fact, I think it is one of, and we're going to hear the author of the work today, use this word, quip. One of David's quips is essentially all language is ambiguous. All language is ambiguous. So we can't perfectly refine with absolute clarity what anyone means when they're discussing things like the philosophy of David Deutsch. But you get, as I say, this condescending anger permeating the piece by someone who says they were a fan or admirer of David Deutsch, read the books, but then ultimately at the end, somehow, although they were impressed, come to the realization that all of it is either false or so obvious as to not be worth stating. So it's hard to tell what mind would, on the one hand, be thrilled to read something new, like the beginning of infinity, and then on the other, at every moment they're turning the page going, wow, this is really good stuff. But then, and at the end, they really enjoy it and they like it. And for some years go by, and then they realize, upon talking to some other people, apparently, this seems to be what has happened, reach the conclusion that it was all so obvious in retrospect. Of course, it's obvious once you've read the book. The way English grammar works to me is so obvious in retrospect. It's so simple that I don't know why anyone bothers teaching English to these speakers of non-English, because it's so obvious. Or mathematics. Mathematics is just logical. Why bother learning any of this stuff? It's so obvious. It's so obvious that 1 + 1 = 2, that if you can accept that, everything else follows. This is the tone of the article. So again, as I say, the title of the article is the Deutschian Dead End by a fellow called Kazra. He begins with a preamble that praises David Deutsch as one of the most brilliant physicists and philosophers of our time. The introduction begins, and I hesitate to begin reading long sections, but I'm going to have to if I'm going to respond to it. But it's just such a long article, and the same errors sort of made over and over again. But they do begin with, this is about some of the technical details of David Deutsch's philosophy. I can stop them there because it's not. It really isn't. It, at best, is a very superficial overview that contains deep misconceptions about the entire project of philosophy, which is the way I began this live stream today. What I was saying, and I'll emphasize it again, is what the beginning of infinity, David Deutsch's work more broadly on epistemology, is about, and Karl Popper's, is trying to solve the problem of what knowledge is and how it grows. What knowledge is and how it grows. Because if we can understand that, we can help it to grow faster, have institutions and traditions in place that help to make progress faster, because it's what knowledge really is all about. It's about solving our problems. And so we get better technology, better cures, longer life, healthier, wealthier, and wiser, all of that sort of stuff. So we want to understand what knowledge is and our relationship to knowledge as knowledge creators. That's the problem that's being solved by David Deutsch and Karl Popper when it comes to their epistemology. What I want to say to Kazra, our author of this particular piece, is what problem are you trying to solve? Because you can read the article for yourself and you realize no alternative is being offered. What you get is essentially David Deutsch, Karl Popper, boo, I don't like it, boo. But there's no alternative offered. At best, towards the end, we get something about meaningness and nebulosity, this weird thing that this fellow David Chapman has created, which I've critiqued before, which I've critiqued as being very, very similar in spirit and substance to all those other relativists and postmodernists that are out there that fail to be clear enough. And as David says, one reason that, you know, in Philosophers, chapter 11, I think, of the Beginning of Infinity, Philosopher's History of Bad Philosophy, a physicist's history of bad philosophy, I should say. That way, that style of writing that relativists have, that flowery, verbose linguistic technique, is designed so as to hold the philosophy immune from criticism, So it is a chutzpah. It is absurd for the author of this piece that I'm about to talk to you more about to say that David Deutsch is, and critical rationalism is holding itself immune from criticism. That is some high-level projection, if ever there was some, because the fellow here doesn't seem to have an alternative to point to. There's very little of substance to say, well, if critical rationalism is getting so much wrong, what's the right view? What is correct? You can't, a critique does not just consist of saying, this is wrong, I don't like it. This is wrong, I don't like it. This is wrong, I don't like it. You have to say why and what the alternative is. I may feel uncomfortable with the idea that the universe commenced 13.7 billion years ago in a Big Bang, because it may make me feel uncomfortable for the question to arise, how? What caused it? But if everything is pointing to that fact, that the universe actually had a beginning, it had an origin, perhaps not in time, but it had an origin. Time began and space began 13.7 billion years ago. If we start to ask the question, what caused the universe? What made the universe possible? Any way you want to frame that, that may make some people feel uncomfortable and they may demand an answer, like God. And then, of course, if you dare to ask what created God or what caused God, it's then that they say, well, God needs no creator. So then, of course, you may as well say, well, the universe needs no creator and so on. But it doesn't solve the problem of why the universe, what made the universe possible, let's say. And so sometimes we can just say, this explanation is not comprehensive. There can be no completely comprehensive explanation. The Big Bang opens up questions. No one ever says that critical rationalism, that Popperian epistemology, the work of David Deutsch, answers everything we ever wanted to know or could possibly ever ask about the nature of knowledge and how it grows. As I've said before, I am working on, very slowly, it's a long process, I'm realizing, on a constructor theory of knowledge. I'm trying to work through that. It's slow going, I'm doing other things as well, but why would I do that? If I thought that Karl Popper and David Deutsch had it all wrapped up, had said everything that ever needed to be said ever on the topic of epistemology, on what knowledge is and how it is created, how it improves, how it generates progress, all that sort of stuff, how error correction works, then I wouldn't bother. But I am, because I don't think that there are final answers here. There are just better and better explanations that get us nearer to what reality really is. Okay. So let me see. The author of this piece writes, I should include some background on myself. I originally discovered Deutsch about 4 years ago, and I became obsessed. I read multiple of his and Karl Popper's books, papers, lectures, and interviews, and took many thousands of words and notes on all of it. I really felt like I was coming face to face with a profoundly significant set of ideas, a deeply clear, comprehensive, and coherent picture of reality, end quote. So let's keep that in mind. They felt as if they were getting a coherent picture of reality. They were excited. In other words, I could have written something like that. Wonderful. But at the end, just keep in mind, at the end, he is going to accuse the very same content, okay, which he's just said is a profoundly significant set of ideas. He's going to accuse it of being nothing but a set of obvious trivialities, obvious truths and trivialities, or something like that. So how do we square this? Well, it may not be a problem for this author. And the reason it may not be a problem for this author is because he's coming from the school of David Chapman, who doesn't mind a contradiction. And why doesn't he mind a contradiction? Because his entire philosophy is to say that nothing that he does is actually philosophy. So you cannot critique him for his philosophy, because his philosophy is not a philosophy. He's doing something else. In which case I responded, when this was raised to me that, well, Brett Hall, you're taking this nebulosity stuff too seriously as a philosophy. It's not a philosophy. It's more like self-help or something like that. I said, oh, okay, well, good on them then, fill your boots with your self-help. Go for your life explaining that words don't have precise meanings. No one ever said they did, except for Wittgenstein, certainly not Karl Popper. That the words are nebulous and that reality is nebulous. No one has ever denied this kind of framing of what language is. We agree, language is ambiguous. Karl Popper said, you cannot speak in such a way as you cannot be misunderstood. It's always possible to be misunderstood. Language is ambiguous. Does that mean language is nebulous? Maybe. Okay, you can use that word. So it appears there's no debate. But then, as Jake said to Chris on the Do Explain podcast, something like that, or to David himself, when I listened to that conversation, which, by the way, gave me the feeling of, okay, Jake is asking David questions, getting the answers, and everything seems to make sense. But Jake wanted to say something like, well, we're not just saying the language is nebulous, we're saying reality itself is nebulous, which again, itself is an ambiguous statement. All of the stuff is ambiguous. The entire philosophy is ambiguous, but then again, so is everything else. And to say that reality is ambiguous, that's fine, and I'll come back to that. But I don't have any big dispute with that. What I have a dispute with is, what problem are you solving? What is motivating any of these eruptions that Karl Popper and David Deutsch have got it all wrong? If you're a person like me who wants to understand what is knowledge, how does it grow, how do we move from one problem to a better problem, what are people doing with their minds when they encounter a problem and try and articulate the possible space of solutions? What is happening there? These are interesting, fascinating questions. How do we decide whether reality consists of forces of gravity or the curvature of space-time? What is the role of the experiment in any of this? Karl Popper and David Deutsch provide answers for all of this. And so when you say, well, they're completely wrong, or it's a bunch of banal trivialities, okay, but what is the alternative to conjecture and refutation? What is specifically wrong? What are you objecting to? rather than having an emotional reaction that seems, as I say, this kind of angry, condescending tone throughout the thing. So already he's arguing from a position of authority. He's saying, I've read David Deutsch's work and I've read Karl Popper's work and all these papers and things, so I'm in a position to critique him now. Because his very next sentence, after saying, I really felt like I was coming face to face with a profoundly significant set of ideas, blah, blah. He then goes on to say, I now believe this was wrong and that I had fallen prey to a number of fairly obvious conceptual and psychological errors. End quote. Fallen prey, as if there is this net being cast by these nefarious Popperians and critical rationalists trying to capture and lure in young people and flood their mind with fairly obvious conceptual and psychological errors. And by the way, it's all psychologizing. There's very little philosophy here, but that's one of the other criticisms that I have of the David Chapman school of thought, is that it is psychology. He denies that he's doing philosophy anyway, so you can't critique him on that basis. So you're going to hear some very heavy psychologizing throughout the piece. What David Deutsch or Karl Popper believe, what critical rationalists believe, what's going on inside of their minds. Again, none of that is ever of much interest to me. What X thinks about Y, what this person thinks about that. I'd much rather concentrate on the ideas. Why should we endorse the many worlds interpretation of quantum theory? What are the reasons? What are the ideas that lead us from a single particle twin slit experiment to a multiverse of fungible instances of all particles that we experience in our own universe? How do we get from one place to another, conceptually speaking, like that? I'm not interested in people's minds and what they think. I'm interested in what the best ideas are that explain this stuff. Okay, so I think the author of this piece, Kazra, was coming, and we will see this, he was coming to the beginning of infinity already sort of filled with many psychological hang-ups, and was, I think, expecting to get out of the beginning of infinity something other than what is being offered there, which is explanations of things like science and mathematics and progress and political systems. The nature of physical reality, it's not there as a self-help guide, but many people have rightly said that it has given them a sense of optimism in their life, that inculcated as they were at school or university or elsewhere by the media, with pessimistic prophecies of doom, this was a great antidote. But I can imagine that if you hear that kind of talk, and if you hear other people talking about the beginning of infinity in these rapturous tones about what a wonderful book it is and how profoundly affecting it was to them, then I can imagine if you are a person that is already in some sort of distress psychologically, let's say, and you read the book and you think, yeah, this is profoundly exciting and whatever else, and you think there are some good ideas there, and you get to the end of the book, and you find your problems are still there in your personal life and whatever, you might be angry because everyone else that you were listening to was saying how wonderful this is, and you haven't had your life changed. No one made the promise to you. No one guaranteed that your life would be changed. And so it's not the fault of critical rationalism or anything else that you were disappointed in retrospect with not having the profound experience that other people have. People can have different experiences and different reactions to things. And by the way, a lot of what is written in this article, and I suppose I'm really speaking to people who've already read the article, but otherwise, it seems to be a critique of the beginning of infinity in a sort of hand-waving way without actually ever quoting at length, substantively, the beginning of infinity. We get quotes from Chiara Marletto's book, quotes from Popper, Richard Rorty, some of the author's other favorite writers and things, but nothing really, like here's a section from the chapter on optimism, a nice excerpt, and here's what I think is wrong with it. There's nothing like that. There's nothing like that. Okay, so I'm just going to skip a bit. A note on terminology, writes the author. In this essay, I'll be grouping together the ideas espoused by David Deutsch, Brett Hall, Karl Popper, and Chiara Miletto into one loose bucket, which I'll refer to interchangeably as critical rationalism, or the Deutschian, or the Popperian worldview. Okay, nice to get name check there. Nice to be on a list of the author's enemies, apparently. I'm in very good company. This is good. Again, this desire to have teams, movements, to align yourself with ideologies creates enemies. This is why I don't like objectivism. It's why I have an article out there on my own Substack to give that a bit of a boost. I think it's on the Substack, literally titled "Why I'm Not a Popperian" or "Why I'm Not a Critical Rationalist." And I'm not. I think there are great ideas within Popper's work and within Deutsch's work. The last thing I'd ever call myself is Deutschian. It's very weird, and I agree, cultish. I have great respect for Ayn Rand, but I never call myself an objectivist. I think there are some good ideas within Judaism. Can't call myself a Jew. Good ideas surround us. They can come from any direction. Bad ideas can be found anywhere as well, and so it's incumbent upon us all to curate our own way through the world rather than adhere to labels. So I'm not answering to being a critical rationalist, but I can say that I've read a lot of Popper, and so therefore I can explain where this fellow goes wrong, in my view. So the fellow goes on and he says, put most succinctly, the critical rationalist mistake is that they view the world in terms of simplistic dichotomies. End quote. So they do. This team of critical rationalists, like, it becomes very personal. It becomes and as he will admit himself, this is a work of sociology, which is bizarre. And this is why I have such difficulty grappling with it, because I like to do philosophy rather than psychology. I'm not interested in what's going on in the internal workings of a person's mind. Because whenever I've talked about in the past, and I have at length, critiqued empiricism, I've never been tempted to frame things in terms of like, those empiricists over there, they're so naive, Hume and Locke and what a bunch of ignoramuses. Of course, no. I would like to outline my understanding of what empiricism is as being able to observe things directly and derive from those observations theories of reality. To see, the laws of nature written in the book of nature, so to speak. That kind of thing. That's a mistake. But talking about empiricists rather than empiricism, I think it's a misfiring of something. And it tends to turn, we have this whole problem with identitarianism right now, and identity politics. It's just another manifestation of that, attacking critical rationalists, the group of people. Okay, he goes on to say, quote, they formulate theories for how things work, say, how humans obtain knowledge about the world, and then fit every conceivable piece of evidence into that theory, end quote. Oh, no, I should say, he goes on. Yeah, so the critical rationalists fit every conceivable piece of evidence into that theory, making their ideas effectively immune to criticism, end quote. So he's using David Deutsch's phrase, okay, talking about how things can be held immune from criticism, and trying to use it in order to critique sloppily the content of critical rationalism. They formulate theories for how things work and fit every conceivable piece of evidence into that theory. Well, no, they don't. They don't do that because they understand what evidence is and what the function of evidence is. Evidence is to decide between theories already guessed. So already, trying to say that this is how critical rationalists use evidence by fitting every conceivable piece of evidence in order to fit that theory just reveals a deep, deep misconception about the worldview and about evidence and just the basics of what the worldview entails. So I would implore Kazra, the author, or anyone who thought that there was merit in this piece, to read, for example, The Logic of Experimental Tests by David Deutsch. And that can help you understand the role of evidence. It's a refrain we hear over and over again, but we're not, as I will come to, we're not going to be offered an alternative. We're just going to be told over and again that this is critical rationalism going wrong. So he's just said that of critical rationalists, their ideas are being made immune to criticism. And then he goes on to say, quote, "The way I'll make many of the arguments in this essay is oblique rather than direct," end quote. The irony, the lack of self-awareness is astonishing. But again, the author, I presume, is going, or could claim, I'm not doing philosophy. Unlike David Chapman, I'm a non-philosopher just writing things down. So if you are going to write an essay that is a critique of critical rationalism, but you say that your arguments are not direct but oblique, what is that? What is that? Having just in the prior sentence charged the people you are critiquing, your opponents, with holding their ideas immune from criticism, he says that he's going to make oblique rather than direct arguments. So let me be direct. Phrasing things, phrasing your arguments in any way other than direct is a way of holding your ideas immune from criticism. Saying that you're about to make oblique arguments rather than direct ones holds your ideas immune from criticism. You are guilty. You are guilty of the very thing that you are charging critical rationalism with. It's absurd. As I say, David Chapman is the chief among the writers and thinkers of this. Assertion, assertion, assertion. And then you say, I've got a problem with that. And he can say, well, I'm not making a case or an argument. I'm not making an explanation. I'm not doing philosophy here. So this is the tenor. This is the tone, the tenor of the piece. Okay. Some of my, the author goes on to say, quote, "Some of my points will be about the meta of Deutsch's statements rather than the substance of them. I'll even make some sociological observations rather than purely technical philosophical ones." Again, this is like, it's something that Kamala Harris could have written, to be honest. Some of my points will be the meta of David Deutsch's statements rather than the substance of them. If you're going to critique critical rationalism or the work of David Deutsch, critique the substance, critique the ideas. I don't know what else you're critiquing. The meta? The motivations he had for writing the book? Some, homespun psychology perhaps is being done here. And making some sociological observations rather than technical philosophical ones, when he said at the beginning that he was going to make technical arguments about the technical aspects of David Deutsch's work, and now he's saying he won't. He's making sociological observations. These are just sociological observations. I'm not making an argument here. I'm not making a philosophical case. I'm making an observation. He goes on to say, quote, "I think this is necessary because, as I'll try to demonstrate, critical rationalism is based on a set of mutually reinforcing assumptions and framings that are effectively impossible to refute all at once, purely on the substance of their claims." A full stop, end quote. There is no basis of critical rationalism. There's no fundamental place that you begin with critical rationalism. There is a network of things that hold together that provide a lens through which to understand something like knowledge. That's what it is. What is this thing, knowledge? Because we can't justify as true our beliefs, which is what almost all other epistemologies are about. Turning, by the way, epistemology into psychology if it becomes about beliefs. And epistemology is not about beliefs, it's about knowledge, and knowledge can be instantiated in physical objects. Another insight from Popper that is so exciting, but which the author here doesn't grapple with. It is not impossible to refute critical rationalism all at once. It's not impossible. There's no physical law that says it could not possibly be refuted. But the fact that no one has refuted it, and spoiler alert, nor does this author by the end of it refute anything in the oeuvre of Karl Popper or David Deutsch, nothing. It is, as I say, Kamala Harris word salad type commentary. If you're not going to focus on the substance of the claims, if you're not going to focus on the arguments, if you're not going to deal in precision by providing quotes, why all the hate and anger? Why this emotional eruption about the work of Karl Popper and David Deutsch? I don't know. I don't understand the motivation. I could guess, but again, that's not really my thing to go into. Why people are compelled. Perhaps it's to get clicks. We are in the age of look at me, I suppose. And so, as I think the great Ricky Gervais has said, some people think that the only way they can raise themselves up is by bringing down someone else. So there's a sense of that throughout this. The critique, such as it is, could have been written without mentioning the names Popper and Deutsch. It'd be harder, but it would also be more pleasant to read, because this constant refrain, as they go on to say, let me read it. Quote, "There is no single definitive contradiction within the philosophy. If there was, Popper and Deutsch themselves would have found it long ago. But it's possible to step just outside of the philosophy to see the web of framings, rationalizations, and everyday behaviors that make up the worldview, to see the problems in it. The Deutschian worldview is a kind of philosophical local maximum from which it's impossible to move towards greater conceptual clarity without first taking apart a lot of conceptual scaffolding." End quote. This is one of those hugely condescending parts of the piece. And I get this impression from, again, people like Chapman and others. Because what they're saying is, I understand the worldview, but I can do something better. I have the capacity to step outside, and I have stepped outside of the worldview. And from my vantage point, from my God's eye view, outside of the Deutschian paradigm, I can see all the problems within it that you, poor denizens who are still trapped within the Popperian worldview, cannot possibly see because you are blinded to the rest of wider reality and philosophy and nebulosity. It's condescending. That's the best that I can say about it. Incoherent is another thing I would say about it. The Deutschian worldview is a kind of philosophical local maximum from which it is impossible to move towards greater conceptual clarity. Why? Isn't David Deutsch's expression of how knowledge is generated with hard-to-vary explanations and the concept of the person as the universal explainer building upon the work of Karl Popper? Now, had there been no David Deutsch, would this author have said the Popperian worldview is a kind of philosophical local maximum from blah, 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 blah? Now, if it is a local maximum, that means it is in principle impossible for anyone to improve upon it. And anyway, the whole thing is, as I keep saying, without offering an alternative, a nicely expressed alternative philosophy of science or epistemology, we've got nowhere to jump to. Even if we were persuaded in some way, shape, or form that in fact there was some merit to this author's claims, because it's kind of a version of the Duhem-Quine thesis. People could say all day long that something like conjectural knowledge, as critical rationalism understands the term, is wrong They can say that it's wrong. They can say things like, you really can justify your beliefs as true, and any Popperian who says otherwise is just ignorant. That is not a criticism. That's not a criticism of Popperian epistemology. It's just an assertion. There's no explanation. But more than that, there's no alternative being offered. You might say, oh, they're offering up justification and truth. But okay, how? How do you justify something as true? What is the alternative? The author goes on to say, quote, "A big part of my motivation for writing this essay is psychological." No joke. He continues, "What I would like to do is help a version of myself 3 years in the past who, by virtue of being so absorbed in the Deutschian worldview, felt a sense of existential loneliness and got into a number of silly arguments in which he tried to convince others of this worldview. You might go as far as calling it a religion." End quote. Okay, so there, I have compassion for this. As I said, this is a kind of angst. And the angst appears to still be with the author. The author has gone into the Deutschian worldview. He's picked up the beginning of infinity, expecting it to be able to solve his existential loneliness. He has existential loneliness. So I get it. I feel sympathy, pity, compassion, all of that stuff. I get it. But it's too high a bar to say that if you have existential loneliness and you see that other people over there do not have existential loneliness, but indeed appear to be enjoying and having fun discussing this book called The Beginning of Infinity, and so you pick it up thinking, perhaps you've listened to someone like me saying, this is a wonderfully motivating, inspiring book that provides you a worldview about how to think about things, and you're listening and you're going, aha, I want that as well. I'm over here existentially lonely and depressed and all sorts of terrible things. As many young people, especially men in their early 20s, do indeed experience. Late teens, early 20s. Existential loneliness and angst. I get it. So if you hear someone like me talking in these terms about this particular book, my intention was never to say, this is going to cure all your psychological ills. All of your personal problems will dissolve as you begin to appreciate the wonders of the cosmos and knowledge and infinite progress and all that stuff. It's true that is inspiring and optimistic, and for some people, some of the time, it can lift them out of their loneliness and pessimism. But I would never mean to prescribe that as a treatment. If you have existential loneliness, I'm not going to say to you, pick up The Beginning of Infinity. I'm going to say, find a friend and have a conversation, or a family member. And failing that, go and seek some counseling. Get some help. Because The Beginning of Infinity, perhaps the prescription is you need to already be a well-functioning, possibly even reasonably well-read person. This is why many people have said, could we have a version of The Beginning of Infinity that would be good for children? Okay, children can read The Beginning of Infinity, but it is, the background knowledge there. Okay, background knowledge is a real thing. You do want to have a reasonable vocabulary going into things, an interest, as I said at the beginning, an interest in science. That's where I was coming from. I was coming from, I'm really interested and excited about science. And so it was just excitement built upon excitement and built upon excitement of having my questions answered at just the right time. So it all worked for me. But if you're not in that position of having the first and primary passion and love of your life being science, in particular physics, then I don't know what to say to you, because my experience is not of just being lost and lonely and angry and anxious about life. But if you are in that position, I say again, it's not the fault of The Beginning of Infinity of David Deutsch or Karl Popper that you, having read their work, still feeling or having exacerbated your sense of existential loneliness. It's not supposed to be, Oprah Winfrey or David Deutsch, Oprah Winfrey or Dr. Phil's latest work on how to make yourself feel better about yourself. People search for meaning. I get it. Okay, but as I say, You you have to be like with Popper. Karl Popper, the wonder of Karl Popper that I appreciated so much as a philosopher, I'll say it again, is he is grounded in the problems of science. He's grounded in the problems of science. He's explaining to you why it is people had these theories of electromagnetism or of light and lenses or of gravity and orbits and what orbits are. And he's talking about all these scientists and what they're doing, and you're thrilled as a scientist. But if you're not a scientist and you read conjectures and refutations, I can imagine you get bored. It's like open society and its enemies. If you're not interested already in history and politics and that kind of thing, you're going to get bored. It's not going to solve your problem. You have to be coming to philosophy from outside of philosophy. The philosophy is not a cure-all. You might come from psychology and have problems about theories within psychology, but the beginning of infinity, critical rationalism, is not a self-help manual for fixing your personal psychological issues. That's the function of counseling. Unless you're already quite knowledgeable, very knowledgeable, I would say, possibly, about Popperian epistemology, and then it absolutely helps you. Once you're already psychologically stable and you encounter a problem in your life, which is psychological, whatever happens to be, anxiety, let's say, which we all deal with, critical rationalism can help with that. It can help with that. It can make you realize, okay, we make incremental progress here. Error is the natural state of things. Don't feel bad. Things tend to get better. Problems are soluble. All of that stuff. It works. But I can imagine if you're an extremist and if you don't have much background knowledge and you're already experiencing a certain degree of anxiety, depression, existential loneliness, that being told that problems are soluble is not going to help. But no one ever said that it would, because your problems run deeper than that. They're personal. They're personal to you. Okay, so again, there's more. He says he's saying he's doing sociological stuff. So here he elucidates what he thinks is a mystery. I'll explain that it's not a huge mystery. The author says, quote, "I'm trying to explain the apparent contrast between a large number of people who are convinced that Deutsch's books, The Beginning of Infinity in particular, are some of the most powerful and important books ever written, and an even larger part of the population, including much of the academic philosophy and a decent chunk of the scientific community, who tend to respond to Deutsch's work with ambivalence, appreciating its value, but not recognizing it as revolutionary." End quote. Well, of course. Of course. Anyway, it is, for one thing, it is exceedingly difficult to ever impress an academic about anything ever. When was the last time you heard an academic philosopher from a university say, "This is a profoundly interesting book"? Unless it's the Tractatus by Wittgenstein or something like that. Some book by someone long dead who's not Karl Popper. They don't. They're not excited about anything. It's that sort of the French intellectual arrogant air of "I'm not impressed by anything," that kind of thing. So of course, okay, that's an impossibly high bar that we should expect the academic philosophy and the scientific community to be impressed by by anything. If they appreciate its value, I think that's the best that we can say, but not recognizing it as revolutionary. When was the last time you heard a majority of academics who self-identify as philosophers, a majority, by the way, saying that a particular book is revolutionary? The only one that I can think of, really, is either Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions or Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations or the Tractatus, either of those two. And then name the other philosophers throughout more ancient history. No modern book, nothing from the last, 30 years. So it's no deep mystery. Like, Popper is hated by an overwhelming majority of the academic community. Ayn Rand is hated even more. People, especially academics, find it really and truly fun to hate Popper and Rand. It's a thing. It is a thing. It's a thing that's out there in the academic community and the intellectual community. You're a smart person, according to traditional intellectual culture if you say you hate Ayn Rand, if you say you disagree with Karl Popper, because that elevates you, right? It's the Ricky Gervais thing. Some people think the only way they can lift themselves up, to elevate themselves, is to bring someone else down, rather than contribute a new alternative, something new, something fresh, something insightful and exciting. You just say of those things, they're terrible, they're trivial, they're vacuous nonsense. I don't know why, really, and we've talked about this with David. Why is Popper so hated for so long? Why isn't he respected? Why don't people take him seriously? Now, I don't know. One reason is that Popper and Rand, both together, were highly critical of traditional educational institutions, of the university system, of intellectual culture broadly. And so, of course, your average intellectual isn't going to say, I like Popper or I like Ayn Rand, to people who are very, very anti or critical of traditional intellectual culture. And so this entire piece that I'm going through right now is just on a continuum with that. It's on a continuum with many things, but it's on a continuum with that rejection of iconoclastic gadflies who offer you something new, different to what went before. And also, of course, both Popper and Rand, and this is fresh on my mind, were great defenders of and exponents for the power of the individual and creativity. And this stands in stark contrast to all of academic and intellectual culture as it is today. We're swimming in the collectivist mindset. Most people are walking around with memes running on their minds that say, you can't do it alone. You depend upon the state or the community or whatever. You must rely upon us. You must do as you're told. They have that. And so when someone comes along and says, no, you individually can do it. You are special and creative. You can fix your problems, or at least work on them, and have fun doing so. That is a wonderfully uplifting message. But it stands in stark contrast to the existing intellectual culture, which is far more collectivist. And so there is a kind of a default tendency for people to immediately react quite emotionally in the way that I'm reading here now to anyone who stands for individualism, optimism, and against the currents of what contemporary culture is. You know, things are going to hell in a handbasket and all that sort of stuff. Okay, let me keep going. I'm skipping a bit, and then so he's saying that of other people, they are often, having read David Deutsch, they exist on the spectrum between this was silly and it was pretty good, I guess. So some people apparently are on that spectrum between that, or they could be transfixed or transformed, and transformed, or all the way to this was completely silly. Well, that's, any book, right? Any book, I guess, is like that. Can either transform someone, or the person can walk away from reading it saying, that was silly. Why should David Deutsch's book be any different? Okay, let me read the next paragraph. He goes on to say, quote, Deutsch and the critical rationalists deserve a ton of credit. It's a fundamentally well-intentioned way of thinking. There are many basic tenets of theirs that I still agree with. Knowledge is possible and it's good. Humans have an important role to play in the universe. The scope of what we can know about the world is unimaginably large. Technological progress is a good thing, and much more of it is attainable. The thing is, all of these principles remain true even without the tortured philosophizing that Popper and Deutsch do. Critical rationalism adds an unnecessary pseudo-rigorous veneer onto these more basic and obvious principles. So again, here we have once more the condescension. It's like, patting a child on the head kind of thing. Good boy, you've tried your best, you're well-intentioned, but you're terribly wrong. It competes with some of the worst intellectual posturing that you hear coming out of the university system that I see from time to time. He's saying of the work of David Deutsch, it's all obvious and basic principles. Well, if they were so obvious and basic, why was this author of this very piece so enamored by them initially? Now that he knows them, of course they're obvious. Everything's obvious in the rearview mirror. Okay, he goes on to say, quote, by the nature of Deutsch and Popper's ideas being abstract, this essay will also be necessarily, sorry, I'll start again. Quote, by the nature of Deutsch and Popper's ideas being abstract, this essay will also necessarily be abstract, end quote. No, that's not necessary. It's not necessary. It's not necessarily abstract. Even if, which I do not agree with for a moment, well, except in the ambiguous sense, which we'll come to, there's so much to say about just that one sentence. He's saying Deutsch and Popper write abstractly. I don't agree, but let's go with him. Then therefore the essay will necessarily be abstract. False, absolutely. See my critique of the work of Ayn Rand. Okay, I've got a couple of episodes up there on Topcast all about my criticisms of Ayn Rand's epistemology. Now, what do I do in that? I literally say that she philosophizes in the abstract, and I explain what I mean by that. So it's about thought experiments, imagining what would happen in this particular situation, or in fiction, or, as I say, beginning with a foundation like A equals A as the law of identity, and then from there, deriving, logically, what the epistemology must be. I say that's doing philosophy in the abstract. I don't say it's abstract and just point it and go abstract. All knowledge is abstract. Kezra, author of the all knowledge is abstract. There's no escaping that. There's no escaping. Information may be physical. See my series on it from bit and it from qubit for more on that. Information is physical. But knowledge is abstract, which just means it's substrate independent. You can represent it in a book. You can put it as pixels on a screen. You can put it as neural firings in your mind, sound waves as I speak. The abstract knowledge, the message is the same in each of those cases if you're trying to convey the same piece of knowledge. The knowledge is not identical to any of those physical instantiations. It's an abstraction. So when you say Popper's ideas are abstract, what do you mean? All ideas are abstract. All ideas are abstract. I think what he's trying to say, and incorrectly, what he's trying to say is it's just philosophizing without contact with reality, physical reality. And yet, again, I want to say, I'm trying not to just say, rely on my authority as someone who has read this stuff, but I'm going to have to say it. I've read Hume and Spinoza, Leibniz and Aristotle, Kant and Locke and Mill and Adam Smith. I read these guys. You want to talk about doing philosophy in the abstract? Sometimes some of them do tend in that direction, certainly Spinoza, for example. But Karl Popper and David Deutsch, par excellence, escape from that because they talk about concrete particular instances. Here's the twin slit experiment. I mean, how much more concrete can you get? This is what happens in this experiment in real life. Here is what happened during Eddington's experiment when they were trying to distinguish between Newtonian gravity and the theory of general relativity. That's concrete stuff. Every other page of Conjectures and Refutation talks about another scientist or another philosopher or another thinker doing a particular thing and solving a problem, and him explaining to you how conjectural knowledge works. David Deutsch, likewise, talks about specific things. Him looking at something like a photographic negative where the smudge looks like a galaxy, but then he realizes it's a smudge, and so there was no actual civilization there that he was imagining into existence. It's a concrete thing. It's not philosophizing in the abstract. He's not saying, imagine this situation. No, he's telling you about things that actually happened throughout the history of science or his own life or in politics. It's not abstract. It's the opposite. It's the furthest thing, philosophically speaking, from abstract that I have ever read, and I've read a lot. But again, that's an appeal to authority, to my authority as someone who has read stuff. But all I can say is, if you haven't yet read The Beginning of Infinity, but I think just about everyone who watches my stuff now has, do you think it is highly abstract? Do you think it's highly abstract? You read The Fabric of Reality and he talks to you about Galileo. He talks to you about him being hauled towards the Inquisition. This happened. Now, why is he talking about a specific instance? Because he's talking about the role that the church played in deeming certain ideas as true, no matter the evidence. What a theory and what an explanation is, with specific examples. So it's not abstract. This is just a throwaway attempt at insulting someone because the author of this piece thinks the word abstract is pejorative. Now, it's not pejorative because it actually labels something that's real. Okay, there's physical stuff and there's abstract stuff. There's literally something called the reality of chapter 5, beginning of infinity, I think, the reality of abstractions. So to say that David Deutsch's ideas are abstract is just a simple statement of fact. Of course they are, because they're ideas, and all ideas are abstract. All knowledge is abstract. That's what abstract means. It means not identical to matter. It's not just the atoms. It's not just the neural firings. They encode something. Information that tends to get itself copied. Okay. No, just the next sentence is great. The author says, quote, "To combat this, let me ground the whole essay in a concrete empirical bet. Popper's ideas about epistemology and David Deutsch's extensions of them will forever remain in the footnotes of the history of philosophy," end quote. So again, the lack of self-awareness is astonishing. How can that, a bet about forever, he's literally said there, David Deutsch and Karl Popper's work will remain forever in the footnotes of history. Let me make you a concrete bet. Well, okay, when we get to the end of forever, then I'll be able to collect on my bet, will I? That's not a concrete empirical bet. That's a ridiculous assertion. That's just an attempt to insult the work of Karl Popper and David Deutsch. There's no way you can make a bet about forever. What's going to happen at the end of forever? I bet you the universe won't last 55 trillion years. It'll last forever. Or just say, I bet the universe will last forever. Ready to collect? I'll bet you $1 million that it lasts forever. So but why bother prophesying anyway? Even if he had said, I bet Karl Popper and David Deutsch's work will be a footnote in exactly 30 years from now, and no one will be talking about them anymore. Like, I'd happily take that bet. I'm sure they will be talking about them. But what does it matter? I mean, David Deutsch, it's not, it's an attempt at an insult, but remember, David Deutsch himself says of his own work that it's footnotes to Popper, and many of us object to that. The author goes on, quote, Popper's falsificationism, which was the main idea that he's widely known for today, will continue to remain the only thing that he's widely known for, end quote. Popper is indeed widely known for that, but only within certain circles. Anyone who's not interested in the philosophy of science won't know that. And indeed, people who are more interested in political science know him for things like the paradox of tolerance. That, in fact, I've met some people, I've spoken to some people who only know Popper for that. Oh, isn't he the guy that did the paradox of tolerance thing? So, I don't know what the point of saying any of this is. Popper is never going to... There's not many famous philosophers, period, right? What is Wittgenstein best known for in the wider world? I don't know. If I asked a random family member or a friend, what does the name Ludwig Wittgenstein mean to you? They'd likely say nothing at all. Was he a historian? Was he a scientist? They wouldn't have a clue. Karl Popper likewise. Widely known, presumably here, means within academia. Okay, fair enough. Big deal. The author goes on to say, the frustrating fact that Wittgenstein is widely regarded as a more influential philosopher than Popper will continue to remain true. I agree, but who cares? Educational institutions across the world love Wittgenstein. I know. I've talked about that at length before. And they detest Popper for reasons I've already articulated here in this response. Okay. Goes on to say, critical rationalism is a kind of philosophical dead end, the Deutschian dead end. I think he thinks that the alliteration somehow makes a deeper point than what it does. Deutschian, as I like to say, isn't a word except among the critics of the work of David Deutsch, who are often angry, emotional people. I don't know why. Then there's a long quote from Chiara Marletto that the author has inserted here, and he writes in response to Marletto. Marletto, quote, Marletto claims that Popper has elucidated the process by which new knowledge is created, but has he really elucidated anything? This passage exemplifies one of the central critical rationalist tendencies, framing your theories in terms of highly abstract concepts, blah, 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 blah. There's nothing here, okay, as I say, this is the third time I'm going through this, that actually offers us any reason to doubt the critical rationalist claim, or the Popperian claim, that knowledge is generated via a method of conjecture and refutation. Like, in fact, the author provides a reasonably good summary of what critical rationalism is, but he just says that he doesn't like it for some reason. It says, what makes critical rationalism appealing is the way it seems to unify disparate ideas. It literally unifies all of human activity into one big category of knowledge creation via conjecture and refutation. Well, I wouldn't say all of human activity, but never mind that. As you're going about your day, walking around, you're creating conjectures and criticizing them. Yes, evolution is also doing the same thing, creating and criticizing implicit conjectures. Not really. Not really. There's a stark difference between explanatory knowledge and genetic knowledge. Whether we can consider a mutation a conjecture or not is stretching things a little bit too far. He goes on to say, everything is about knowledge. DNA contains knowledge. Technology contains knowledge. All of culture is a bunch of knowledge. What distinguishes good art from bad art is the fact that it has more knowledge. I don't know about that. But this is the idea of knowledge without a knower, objective knowledge, which the author doesn't grapple with much at all. The word objective doesn't appear here. There's very little contact with fallibilism and what fallibilism is all about as well, which I think is an inspiring part of the philosophy, to talk about how everyone could be wrong, and the way in which we improve is by identifying errors and correcting them, and we should expect always to be laboring under a misconception to some point. But we can find some truth some of the time by generating good explanations of the physical world. So the author then concludes that section by saying, to be fair, Popper and Deutsch's epistemology goes deeper than this idea of conjecture and refutation, and so on. But again, I say, there is nothing in this piece or the work of David Chapman or anyone else who, although they say things like it's a bunch of banal trivialities and obvious claims, they don't say, well, what's wrong with saying that the growth of knowledge is about conjecturing new ideas and then attempting to refute them? And the ideas that survive that process, that evolutionary process, are the best ideas that remain in place until such time as we find error with them. Now, once you understand that, of course, everyone who sufficiently well understands that goes, how could it have been otherwise? Of course, that's so obvious in retrospect. But saying it's obvious in retrospect is not a criticism of the idea. F equals MA is obvious in retrospect, false though it is. Learn the special theory of relativity and you'll go, amazing, obvious in retrospect. I wouldn't say a bunch of banal trivialities. Okay, now there's a section titled Observation is not always theory-laden. Again, spoiler alert, we never find out when, under what circumstances, we can actually have direct observation without it being theory-laden. We just get listed, like you can obviously you can directly observe what clothes you're wearing. We'll see this. Okay, so the first example that the author tries to hold up as being a refutation, but not. A refutation of this idea that observation is theory-laden is where he says, quote, a statement that you might naively think of as purely observational, quote, the temperature of the water in this cup is 40 degrees Celsius, is actually loaded up with a bunch of implicit theories and concepts like the concept of water temperature dimensions, the notion of Celsius, the idea of numbers, the idea of a cup. So when you make such a statement, it's not a pure objective observation because it carries this baggage of implicit theories with it. There are even theories embedded in the very structure of the language you're using, and so on and so forth. All quite right, okay? But remember, the author is disagreeing with that. He's telling you what theory-laden means, but then he's going to say that he doesn't agree with it, that not all observation is theory-laden. But even in that list of things, he misses perhaps the most crucial part. If you are saying, for example, the water is 40 degrees Celsius, the more important theory-ladenness aspect of that, the reason why you can't just say, we look at the thermometer, it says 40 degrees, therefore it is 40 degrees, is because we have a theory about thermometers, measuring devices, being physical objects, obeying the laws of physics. None can possibly be perfectly accurate. And so, in fact, a good Popperian, or someone who has read the work of David Deutsch, will know very well that saying, strictly speaking, saying the water is 40 degrees Celsius is meaningless on the critical rationalist's view. Why? Because it doesn't mean anything to say that something is 40 degrees Celsius unless you give me the uncertainty of the measuring instrument. Is the measuring instrument plus or minus 10 degrees Celsius? In which case, it's not really 40 degrees. It could be as high as 50, as low as 30. In truth, when physicists and chemists quote numbers like this, they say it's 40 plus or minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. Because we have a theory about what temperature is and how the measuring device works and why it can't possibly just deliver us the truth. And even saying that it's within that range, 39.5 all the way up to 40.5, we could still be wrong. Our theory could be wrong about how the thermometer works. And perhaps the thermometer only works at sea level or something like that. Who knows? There could be all sorts of aspects of what we assume to be going on, which just aren't so. The author goes on to say, why is the theory-ladenness of observation so important? This brings us to the second Popperian principle, which is that the truth is not manifest. Popper stakes this claim in contrast to some other philosophers who claim we can have direct access to the truth of the world through our senses. Popper very rightly points out that the truth is not obvious because we can be deceived in many ways. Okay, end quote for the moment. So again, it's one of those sections, and this is really a theme throughout this article. He agrees with Popper, agree, but then just says he doesn't like it for some reason. So here he's agreeing with Karl Popper that seemingly the truth is not manifest, but then he's going to contradict himself later on. Okay, anyway, Popper very rightly points out that the truth is not obvious because we can be deceived in many ways. Okay, there are countless examples of this, from mundane optical illusions to errors in our measuring instruments to superstitions that taint our experience of the world. All these are sources of fallibility. They act as barriers to our direct access to the truth. So remember, end quote, the reason, aside from the fact that it's simply true that the truth is not manifest, a motivation, an impulse for focusing on theory-ladenness, focusing on whether or not truth can be manifest, you just look and you find the truth, is to reject authoritarianism, authorities anywhere, to reject dogma. As Popper says, the doctrine that the truth is manifest is the root of all tyranny. It's the cause of tyranny. If you think you've got the truth in hand because you've read it in the Holy Book or you've seen it, you're liable to defend it with your life. A person who claims truth is manifest will insist that they have the truth in hand, therefore they have a special authority over it and over us, over everyone else. It's an old impulse if someone stands up and says the truth is not manifest, and you don't like that because you think you've got a special insight into the truth, you are aping an impulse that has a long history, that almost everyone ever has had a tendency to pursue, which is to dogmatically adhere to particular ideas that you have an emotional attachment to say, this is the truth, it's manifest to me, and I demand that you agree with me. So the author of this has rediscovered that. It could be the case that because David Deutsch and the Beginning of Infinity and Karl Popper's work are reacting against the misconceptions of people who made errors earlier and elsewhere, that if you don't already know about the history of ideas, if you don't already know science and philosophy, if you don't already know at least some of that, having read it, whether at school or university or in your own time, if you don't understand the existing literature and therefore have an appreciation of why it is that Popper and Deutsch write the things that they do, then I get it. You read Popper and Deutsch, you read The Beginning of Infinity, imagine it's one of the first long books you've ever read. It gets in and you think, wow, that's amazing, that's really insightful, that's interesting. But if you never read the false stuff first, if you weren't already taught the false stuff first, maybe when you encounter the false stuff, it then seems like it is a revelation because it disagrees with what Popper and Deutsch say. But you've got things around the wrong way. It's one theory. I'm taking it too seriously. But most people, most of the time, will have been inculcated at school with this idea that, you just look at the thermometer and it tells you the truth. Truth can be manifest. You can get to certainty, for example, in mathematics, all of that sort of stuff. That's usually the operating system that people are carrying around with them. And to undo that, to undo the idea that you can just look at the world and understand reality, you need, Karl Popper and David Deutsch's work helps. Okay, so the author goes on to say, now to see the limits of both of these claims, that observation is theory-laden and the truth is not manifest, you need to appreciate the underlying frame in which they're made. The underlying assumption here is that we as humans are irrevocably cut off from the actual objective world, only making tentative conjectures about it, unable to ever verify anything. End quote. No, incorrect, false, utterly. We're not cut off from the actual objective world. No one ever said that. No one's ever said that. We are part of the actual objective world. We are minds running on brains. Now, it's true that our access to the objective world beyond us is via channels of information, physical processes still, but we're not cut off. We just have a need to interpret what the signals from that actual objective world mean, how to explain them. We're part of the world we're trying to explain. But it's true, unable to ever verify anything we know. It's got verify and square quotes. True. Verify means establish as once and for all finally true. Absolutely true. Without error true. Infallibly true. That's all we're saying. That is impossible. It's an impossibly high standard. And anyway, an undesirable standard. Because if you were to get there, if you were to get to this final, ultimate, inerrant, infallible truth, progress would stop. You'd be there, you'd have the answer, and you could stand upon the summit of your verified truth and tell everyone else that because you are in possession of the truth, that they should listen to you. Because you cannot be wrong. There is no error in the ultimate truth. There's been a long history of that. He also goes on to say that critical rationalists say that the entirety of our knowledge is, as they put it, a bunch of unjustified untruths. But not the end quote. The impression the author gives there is as if to say all untruths stand on equal footing. It's quite right that the physics of Galileo is better than the physics of a random hobo on the street that's just guessing at what the laws of motion are. Galileo produced mathematics and theories and explanations that were better than any random guess. Newton improved on that. Einstein improved on that. Quantum theory, quantum field theory, quantum electrodynamics improves on that. We improve. We don't get to the final truth, so they're all untruths. They're not the final truth. The entirety of our knowledge is, as they put it, a bunch of... It's as if to say that this is all that's being said about knowledge. No, it's not. Poetically, as I like to say, David Deutsch has explained that knowledge is information that once instantiated in a physical substrate tends to cause itself to remain so. Cara Maletta, knowledge is resilient information. It's information that solves a problem. It's information that has causal power. It's information that is useful, tends to get itself copied because it's useful. And it's useful because it solves a problem. All of this coheres together into this grand explanation of what knowledge is, that is positive and uplifting, and it's just a shame that for whatever reason, this author, like so many before, exists in a long history of people who demand dogma, that have an emotional reaction to someone who says knowledge is conjectural, we make errors, all that kind of stuff. This is my it's my favorite part that I did react to on X. He says, quote, "The critical rationalist picture of the world is one of radical skepticism, born of a metaphysical tradition dating back hundreds of years to Descartes and others, which Deutsch and Popper never seriously questioned," end quote. Now, that's hilarious for numerous reasons. Descartes is never seriously questioned by Deutsch, for example. Well, both do spend quite a bit of time critiquing Descartes. And as I say, I even challenged David Deutsch with this myself. And I understood his perspective because he does spend a long time in the fabric of reality, providing what I would regard as a unique, original critique of Descartes' position that I think, therefore I am, is a necessary truth. This solipsistic idea. So the fact that this author doesn't understand that both Popper and Deutsch do have a critique of Descartes reveals a rank ignorance about the subject that he's writing about. By the way, the critical rationalist picture of the world as one of radical skepticism, well, it says two things. One, the writer, the author, doesn't know what radical skepticism is, and number two, certainly doesn't know what critical rationalism is. Remember that skepticism, radical skepticism, says that you can't possibly be wrong about anything because there's nothing to be wrong about. You're skeptical. Knowledge isn't possible is the skeptic's position. Knowledge isn't possible is the skeptic's position. I'll say it again. So how can a critical rationalist be a radical skeptic? For a radical skeptic is one who says there's no possibility of knowledge, but a critical rationalist says knowledge absolutely exists. It can be instantiated in physical objects, and this is how it grows. It's a real thing. They're opposite to each other, but this author is conflating them together. And worse, fallibilism is fallibilism combined with realism. As I say, realism. Popper and Deutsch are both realists and fallibilists. The realist says objective reality exists, something the skeptic would deny, something the radical skeptic would deny. They're basically on the same side as the relativist. There's no truth, there's no reality. It's all going on in your head or something like that. And fallibilism says you can be wrong as a factual matter. It's always possible to be wrong, but it's only possible to be wrong if there's something to be wrong about, something objectively wrong to be wrong about. You can't be a fallibilist or a critical rationalist unless you deny skepticism, unless you endorse the objective reality of the physical world, to say that stuff exists beyond your mind and you can be right or wrong about it. You can be right or wrong about it. Now, this nebulosity stuff says, who knows? It's very hard to tell. There's no real sense in which you can be right and wrong about stuff. It's all nebulous. It's just a grey goo of ideas. It doesn't really help us to make progress. It might be emotionally helpful, and I think this is one of the the reasons people are attracted to it. And I get it. We can sort of begin to do psychological analysis on our author here, that he's admitted already that he was an angsty person, he was an emotional distress, he was existentially lonely, and so on and so forth. And he didn't find fulfillment in the work of Karl Popper or critical rationalism or anything. And so he's found David Chapman that speaks in these flowery terms, and great, he needs psychology. I get it. But none of his cry for emotional support and help is at all a refutation, and I feel sorry for him and I have compassion, but none of it is a critique of critical rationalism. None of it's a refutation of critical rationalism. In fact, it's silent. It's just he's not happy with stuff. He goes on to say, quote, in this picture, i.e. the critical rationalist picture, we are always groping around the darkness of a cave, mired in our infinite ignorance. This picture misses something absolutely crucial, which is that we as humans are fundamentally part of the objective world. We are embedded in it and even continuous with it rather than irrevocably severed from it. End quote. No one ever said, I want to quote page number, chapter number, to say that we are irrevocably severed from the rest of physical reality rather than being a part of it. It is part of the explanation, following from the universality of computation, that the mind of a person is part of physical reality. What else could it be? What else could it be? It's a mind that is coming to resemble, as I already said, the rest of physical reality. How much more connected to physical reality can you be than that? Being able to conjecture ideas and test them against that physical reality gives you a special relationship with physical reality that no other organism, other species, the non-human species, has or enjoys. That's a deep connection to physical reality, our capacity to explain it. Now, why this author wants to attribute to critical rationalism, to Karl Popper, to David Deutsch, to myself, to Chiara Mileto, etc., positions we do not hold, I don't know, apart from that lazy old tactic of straw manning, just saying, here's what they think, that we are severed completely from reality, that we're not a part of it. No one ever said that. Quite the opposite, the absolute opposite. But to say that it says, we are embedded in it and even continuous with it. Well, what does continuous mean? Well, I can agree that, okay, well, the mind runs on the hardware of the brain, okay, and that's part of the body, and the body is breathing in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide. So in some sense, I'm continuous with the atmosphere. And when I dive into the pool and I'm surrounded by water, skin is continuous with the water. It adds nothing. But what I would say is we've got a problem with ambiguity. The very thing that these people are holding up as central to their understanding of the world, nebulosity, is already explained by both Popper and Deutsch. We use the word ambiguous to describe language, that we can't be perfectly precise. Error is everywhere. Misconception is everywhere. It's as if they are the ones groping in the dark for critical rationalism, and they've got a mangled version of critical rationalism. They can see that there's truth there, and they're angry because they didn't get there first. And I see a lot of this when it comes to Karl Popper. People rediscover it. What David Deutsch does is to add to Karl Popper an inspiring vision. This is my favorite part of the book, of the individual as a creative, crucially important entity with the potential to change the universe. Never before has such a clear statement of that fact been expressed in text that I'm aware of. Bronowski had some very positive things to say, and the ancients had things to say, but never before, blended with the physical sciences, has a philosophy of optimism of that kind been articulated. That is something to be celebrated rather than denigrated. And it's not obvious because the overwhelming majority of people right now agree with Hawking and others who say that people are very limited in their capacity to be able to do anything. Dawkins talking about middle world and our incapacity to understand things. Neil deGrasse Tyson erupting now and again about how the only way that we'd be interested in going to Mars is if there was a global geopolitical catastrophe. It's all false and it's all anti-human. What David Deutsch does is bring to critical rationalism an optimistic cosmic view of humanity. And it's quite right for people to be inspired by that and uplifted by that and made joyful about that. And why there's this impulse to reject it and to be upset by it and to convey a condescending anger, as I keep on saying, about the work of David Deutsch or anyone who reads David Deutsch and enjoys it, I don't know. I don't understand the impulse. Why waste your time being angry and critiquing it? If you have an alternative, like apparently David Chapman does, clarify it for us, please. I've read Chapman stuff. I've listened to Jake try and explain it. What I hear from Jake is, again, philosophy in the abstract. I don't hear, let's talk about anything from the discovery of DNA through to the Big Bang and how fusion works or quantum theory. And you might say, well, that's all irrelevant to me. I'm not interested in that. He will use artificially constructed thought experiments like, if your friend asks you if there's water in the fridge and you say yes, and they go off to the fridge and they find nothing there but an eggplant, you're entitled to say something to the effect of, well, I wasn't lying to you, was I? Because language is always ambiguous. I mean, if that's the best you've got to explain the significance of this nebulosity, meaningless stuff, I don't know what to say to you. It's not a particularly deep insight, nor is it uplifting and optimistic. It doesn't tell me how science works or mathematics. It doesn't help me to think more critically and creatively. It doesn't help me to inspire people who are new to this with how they are significant in the cosmic scheme of things, why it is that we've had a ratcheting up of progress recently, why we should defend things like free speech, free trade, and democracy, how we can expect to perhaps have longevity and possible immortality. All of this is the inspiring vision that comes with the ideas associated with Karl Popper, the ideas that are being rejected here, but where we're being offered nothing as an alternative. Nothing as a substantive alternative. I'll skip a little bit and I'll just read this paragraph. Like, you get, this is something else that passes for critique. Quote, what would it be to see the world as partially pulled apart, that is, making room for pluralism, error, autonomy, individuality, and heterogeneity, and as partially put together, making room for normativity, communion, humility, and transcendence, end quote. I mean, this is, again, it's Kamala Harris's word salad. It's, I don't understand. That's actually, I'm sorry, that I apologize. That's not the author themselves. They're quoting one of their favorite writers, who is Brian Cantwell Smith, writes about transcending this metaphysical frame. So, yeah, the author likes word salad writing. Long word after long word after long word. Postmodern relativist guff. The grey goo of what passes for tertiary education and the kind of stuff you get in graduate philosophy seminars these days. Heterogeneity, normativity, communion. Okay. So I won't continue. This has been over 2 hours now. So I would just implore the listener or the viewer to go to the piece that is there on Substack. I must mention, as I'm just passing through, the author says that there are obvious truths. So let me just quote a bit. He says, quote, I also think there are obvious truths in the realm of science, like the claim the earth is not flat. that your body is made of cells, and that everyday objects follow predictable laws of motion. End quote. So are the laws of motion predictable, or do you mean the paths that they follow enable you to make predictions? That's already ambiguous. Is that a true statement? As for the earth is not flat, it's an obviously true statement. But again, you cannot speak in such a way as to not be misunderstood. Just that claim, the earth is not flat, obviously true. What if that was something that was being said by a surveyor to another surveyor working on a bowling green? They've laid the soil and, and one of them says the earth is not flat, and the other one says, no, the earth is flat. They're not talking about the whole planet. They're talking about that earth there on the bowling green. And one of them is insisting the earth is flat. And eventually the other one agrees the earth is flat. And they both walk away saying, it's wonderful, the earth is flat, because that's what they've been trying for all day, to get the spirit level to ensure that the earth that's there is perfectly flat, that the soil has no bumps and no curves. The earth is flat. This is what we mean by there are no obvious truths. You don't know the context. Now you could build up a whole context and say, well, there are these two astronomers sitting in a room and they're talking about the earth being flat or not. It's an obvious truth the earth is flat. I can imagine all sorts of scenarios where it doesn't matter how precise you try and make your thought experiment, that I can say it's not obvious. I could say the kicker in the tail is that those two astronomers were actors insisting the earth is not flat, or the earth is flat. Now, David Deutsch points this out, the story of the Pope speaking ex cathedra. And he says something that's supposed to be true, but what if it was a rehearsal? What if you yourself saw the Pope saying a particular thing, maybe saying the earth is flat? Maybe the Pope is there saying the earth is flat. And if you, as a good Catholic, insist on believing everything the Church or the Pope says, while he's sitting there in the throne room of the Vatican, and you hear him say it, do you walk away assuming the earth is flat because you heard the Pope say it whenever the Pope speaks ex cathedra from the throne? Or what if the Pope was just rehearsing? And what if the Pope was having a good giggle once you walked out of the room because he knew he wasn't actually speaking ex cathedra at that point? There are no obvious truths. I remember, and again, there's this hugely controversial one that goes around the internet now and again. The 1 + 1 = 2 thing, or 2 + 2 = 4 thing. And, there are a lot of woke academics saying, well, it's not always the case that 2 + 2 = 4. Things are more complicated. But 1 + 1 = 2 is a truth that you can come to understand more deeply. So how obvious is it? Well, it's not obvious to little kids who are first learning to do arithmetic, for example. It takes time to learn that. So obvious to who is a question. There are no obvious truths. But more than that, again, university, doing logic and computation, following Pinot's axioms. I used to have it hanging up in the background. I don't have it anymore. It's one of the earlier, many years ago when I first started the podcast. I would have the 1 A4 page proof that 1 + 1 = 2 was there somewhere. You can do that. Starting with Pinot's axiom. So in what sense is that obvious? What do those symbols mean when you write down 1 + 1 = 2? Saying the earth is flat, obviously true. What if you don't speak English and you hear the earth is flat? Okay. Just check the last few things if there's anything else worth reacting to here. Oh, this was a funny bit where he really leaves the rails, I think. Quote, the author writes, there is one other aspect of the Deutschian frame that Popper and Deutsch never seriously question. It's that the correct way to think about how we obtain knowledge of the world is through the lens of formal logic. The title of Popper's first book is A Logic of Scientific Discovery. He was specifically after a logic of science. And that quest has been continued by Deutsch. The critical rationalists think about science in the frame of forming logical statements and figuring out the truth or falsity of those statements. End quote. So far wide of the mark in a number of ways. Firstly, the author of this piece claims to have listened to the lecture that David Deutsch gave, where he provided a theory of truth and falsity, where he specifically says, and the author claims to have watched and listened with his own ears, David talk about how truth and falsity are properties of propositions, not statements, which are at best approximations to statements. So how could he then also say that David Deutsch thinks that science is about forming logical statements and figuring out the truth or falsity of those statements? No, he doesn't. He doesn't even think statements, strictly speaking, in a formal sense, have truth or false values. They're properties of propositions. So wrong about that. But moreover, no one has ever said, certainly not Popper. Like, I mean, did he only read, did the author of this only read the title of the book, A Logic of Scientific Discovery? The point there is when he says the logic of scientific discovery, it doesn't mean here is a formal logical proof of how science is done. No. He says, I'm not going to quote, but the point of the book is when he uses the word logic there, it's like, this is how science should be understood. Not this is the formal logic of science. Up until the logic of scientific discovery, people generally tended to think of science as being about verifying theories as true by gathering or accumulating more and more evidence, and whether or not you think it's true or approximately true, close to true, more likely to be true, whatever, was about trying to get to the final truth. The logic that Popper was talking about is that we conjecture explanations, and by a method of refutation, if you really want to put it into logic, modus tollens, but never mind that, if the experiment is predicted to have one outcome according to one explanation and a different outcome according to a different explanation, the experiment that decides between them is a crucial test, and that's the logic. The experiment rules out one of them. That's what he means by logic of scientific discovery. That's the logic. The logical thing to do is to accept, tentatively as always, that the theory that made the correct prediction is closer to reality, contains more truth, has corrected an error that the other theory could not account for. The other theory is falsified, refuted. Now, you might think that's trivial or whatever, but that's the logic that's being talked about. He's not saying that all of science is about logical proof. Quite the opposite. There's no formal logic of science. Popper has said, and David has, commented on this frequently, and I've been making the same refrain, which is, Karl Popper doesn't even think there's a scientific method, much less a logic, like formal logic to the way in which science works. He was a professor of scientific method, but said that, the only professor of scientific method in the British Empire, but he would tell his classes that he's here to tell them there is no such thing as a scientific method. Okay. It's just so long and misconceived, this whole thing. Maybe I'll come back to it at some point, but I think we've possibly exhausted my tolerance anyway for this. The thing I will leave people with now, because I really have to go and prepare for my talk with Euron. Far more fun. The central problem is that although ostensibly on the very superficial level, this article appears to be a critique, it's not a genuine critique because no alternative is offered. What Karl Popper and David Deutsch have gifted to us in terms of what knowledge is, information that solves a problem, therefore is useful, tends to get itself copied, has causal power, etc. All of that vision of knowledge and how it grows and what people do and what their relationship to knowledge is and how knowledge and people give us the capacity to have power over physical reality and to generate wealth, which is what is required in order to transform physical reality, all of that stuff. This author may say these are all tortured rationalizations, trivialities, and so on. You can say all that, you can have all that, but they're not genuine criticisms, because you're not actually saying how and why the view that is being offered by Popper and Deutsch is wrong, because you don't have any alternative to offer. I hear no alternative. I read no alternative. And as he says, that in the long run, Karl Popper and David Deutsch will have been ignored, will be ignored, and will continue to be ignored. All I can say, the positive spin on that, I would prefer that it wasn't. I'd prefer that it wasn't. I'd prefer that the ideas spread far and wide, that people would be more optimistic, that people would be less inclined to believe prophets and pessimists and doomers, that people would understand that they are the most important entities in physical reality, a person, error correcting their way to a better world, able to generate wealth and be flames of the Enlightenment to spread freedom and good ideas. I'd like it if more people took that on. But if I wanted to put a positive spin on the alternative, that Popper and Deutsch will continue to be ignored and become footnotes, all I can say to people now is good. Good. Because it means that if you understand Karl Popper and David Deutsch, if you are a proponent of optimism, unbounded progress, knowledge creation, and problem solving, then you have an advantage. Not merely philosophically and in terms of wealth creation or whatever else, but psychologically, you'll be more balanced. You'll enjoy things more because you appreciate that you are in possession of something that, in this author's view, is not going to be taken up by very many people. So you're in a minority. And being in a minority about just about anything, as long as it's true, and it is true, it's a good explanation. There couldn't be anything better than that. Except if everyone in the world, of course, also took on the ideas of Karl Popper and David Deutsch and became optimists and understood that whatever is possible for one person is possible for another. You can generate more wealth and fun and happiness, and you can live off into an indefinite future that you don't have to be mired in pessimism, complete confusion about what you are and what reality is. Okay, I think that will do for now. Thank you to SAS for a $10 donation. And I do notice that there are questions there, but I'm going to have to leave that for another time. We'll do an AMA at some other point. But until next time, bye-bye, and thanks for being with me for at least part of this. And go read that article because, hey, we all like to have a little bit of a reader critique now and again, even if it is, what do I keep on saying? Angsty, existential anger. Bye-bye.